Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Call. Herbert Durham had always prided himself on being a methodical man. At 42, he ran his construction company with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. Measured, calculated, and always 3 steps ahead. His calloused hands gripped the shopping cart handle as his 8-year-old daughter, Cassie, skipped beside him, her pigtails bouncing with each step. "Daddy, can we get the chocolate cereal?" Cassie asked, pointing to a colorful box on the shelf. "You know what your mother says about sugar," Herbert replied, his deep voice carrying the hint of a smile. Despite his stern exterior, Cassie was his weakness, the one person who could crack his carefully maintained facade. The Westfield supermarket was unusually crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. Herbert noticed everything. The way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the squeaky wheel on their cart, the nervous energy of the teenage cashier who kept glancing toward the back of the store. 25 years in construction had taught him to read environments, to spot when something was off. His phone buzzed. Brooke's name appeared on the screen. "Which aisle are you in?" Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that immediately put Herbert on alert. "The cereal aisle." "What?" He kept his tone casual, but his eyes were already scanning the store, cataloging exits and potential threats. "Leave the cart. Take Cassie's hand and walk to the front of the store. Now." The sharpness in Brooke's voice cut through the ambient noise of the supermarket like a blade. Herbert's mind raced. In 12 years of marriage, he'd never heard his wife use that tone. Brooke was many things, controlling, ambitious, sometimes cold, but she was never panicked. "But we're not done shopping," he whispered, instinctively pulling Cassie closer. "I said now." The scream through the phone made several shoppers turn and stare. Without hesitation, Herbert scooped Cassie into his arms and walked briskly toward the front of the store. His daughter's arms wrapped around his neck, and he could feel her trembling. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she whispered. "Nothing, sweetheart. We're just leaving a little early." As they reached the parking lot, Herbert's phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Don't come home yet. Go to your mother's. I'll explain later." The drive to his mother's house passed in a blur. Vera Durham lived in the same modest ranch home where Herbert had grown up, and she greeted them at the door with her usual no-nonsense expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, studying her son's face. "Can Cassie stay here tonight?" Herbert asked, already knowing the answer. His mother had always been his anchor, the one constant in a life that had seen its share of storms. "Of course. But what's this about?" Herbert handed Cassie the remote control and waited until she was absorbed in cartoons before pulling his mother into the kitchen. "Something happened at the store. Brooke called, told me to leave immediately." She wouldn't say why. Vera's weathered hands gripped the edge of the counter. "That girl's been acting strange lately. Secretive. I've noticed it when she drops Cassie off." Before Herbert could respond, his phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his blood freeze. "Active shooter situation at Westfield supermarket. Multiple casualties reported." His hands shook as he opened the article. 3 dead, 7 wounded. The shooter had barricaded himself in the back office before taking his own life. The timestamp showed the incident had occurred exactly 15 minutes after he and Cassie had left. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, but as the shock began to fade, questions flooded his mind. How had Brooke known? Why had she been so insistent about the timing? And why hadn't she wanted them to come home immediately? That night, after putting Cassie to bed in his old room, Herbert sat on his mother's front porch and dialed Brooke's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. "She saved your life today," Vera said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Maybe," Herbert replied, but doubt gnawed at him. In his experience, coincidences were rare. Timing like this didn't happen by accident. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of Brooke's call, the way she'd known exactly where they were, the urgency in her voice, the text telling him not to come home. As dawn broke, Herbert made a decision. He was going to find out exactly how his wife had known to save their lives. And if he didn't like what he discovered, someone was going to pay. Chapter 2, The Discovery. Herbert returned home, the next morning to find Brooke in the kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. She looked up when he entered, her green eyes unreadable. "Where's Cassie?" she asked. "At Mom's. She's fine." Herbert studied his wife's face, searching for tells. "We need to talk." Brooke set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. At 38, she was still beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads at company parties and PDA meetings. But Herbert had learned to see past the surface, to read the calculations behind her smile. "About yesterday, I saw the news alert and panicked. Called you immediately. You called before the news broke." For just a moment, Brooke's mask slipped. Herbert caught it, a flash of something cold and calculating. "I must have gotten confused about the timing. It was traumatic, Herbert. Our daughter could have been killed." Herbert nodded slowly, but his mind was already working. He'd built his business by trusting his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. Over the next week, Herbert began his investigation. He started with their phone records, using his position as the account holder to request detailed logs. What he found made his jaw clench. Dozens of calls to a number he didn't recognize, all made during times when Brooke claimed to be at work or running errands. The number belonged to Jean English. Herbert knew Jean. They'd gone to high school together, though they'd never been friends. Jean had been the golden boy, quarterback, prom king, the guy who'd seemed destined for greatness, but had somehow ended up managing a car dealership in the same small town where they'd all grown up. More digging revealed that Jean had been divorced twice, had a reputation for chasing married women, and had recently filed for bankruptcy. He was also, according to Herbert's research, Brooke's new fitness trainer at the gym she'd joined 6 months ago. The pieces were falling into place, but Herbert needed proof. He installed tracking software on Brooke's phone, a simple app disguised as a battery optimizer that she'd never notice. Within days, he had her complete digital footprint, every text, email, and GPS location. The affair had been going on for 8 months. The messages between Brooke and Jean were explicit, detailed, and filled with discussions about their future together. But it was one particular exchange that made Herbert's blood boil. "Jean, when are you going to tell him?" "Brooke, soon. I just need to time it right. Make sure Cassie and I are protected." "Jean, what about the money?" "Brooke, already transferred to the offshore account. He'll never see it coming." Herbert's fists clenched as he read further. Brooke had been systematically draining their joint accounts, moving money to accounts Jean had helped her set up. She'd also been photographing important documents, business contracts, insurance policies, even blueprints from his construction projects. But the final message thread nearly sent him over the edge. "Brooke, the plan worked perfectly. Got them out just in time." "Jean, you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" "Brooke, Herbert's not that smart. He thinks I save his life. By the time he figures out the truth, we'll be long gone." "Jean, and the shooter?" "Brooke paid as promised. Too bad he decided to take the permanent way out. Loose ends tied up." Herbert's hands shook as the implications hit him. Brooke hadn't saved their lives. She'd orchestrated the entire thing. The shooting at the supermarket hadn't been random. It had been a distraction, a way to make herself look like a hero while she completed her theft of his assets. 3 innocent people had died, so his wife could cover her tracks. That night, Herbert sat in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Hammers, saws, power equipment, instruments of creation that could just as easily be used for destruction. He'd built this business from nothing, worked 18-hour days to provide for his family, and his wife had repaid him with betrayal and murder. He thought about Cassie, safe at his mother's house, unaware that her mother was a killer and a thief. He thought about the families of the shooting victims, grieving while Brooke and Jean celebrated their successful heist. Herbert Durham had always believed in justice. But when the system failed, when the guilty walked free while the innocent suffered, sometimes a man had to take matters into his own hands. He began to plan. Chapter 3. The Blueprint. 3 weeks had passed since Herbert's discovery, and he'd fallen into a careful routine. Each morning, he kissed Brooke goodbye and went to work, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband. Each evening, he returned home and asked about her day, nodding sympathetically as she spun lies about her yoga classes, and book club meetings. Meanwhile, he gathered intelligence with the same methodical precision he brought to his construction projects. Gene English lived alone in a rented duplex on the outskirts of town. His financial situation was worse than Herbert had initially discovered. The man was drowning in debt, desperate enough to participate in murder for money. His ex-wives had both filed restraining orders against him, and his employee records showed a pattern of harassment complained from female staff at the dealership. Herbert also discovered that Gene had a weakness: gambling. Every Thursday night, he attended an illegal poker game in the back room of Murphy's Bar, a dive establishment on the wrong side of town where cash changed hands and questions weren't asked. Brooke's schedule was equally predictable. She met Gene at a cheap motel every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, telling Herbert she was at the gym. She'd also been making regular trips to a storage unit across town, where Herbert suspected she was hiding stolen documents and possibly cash. But Herbert's most important discovery came from an unexpected source: Marcus Webb, a private investigator he'd hired to dig deeper into the supermarket shooting. Marcus was expensive but discreet, a former police detective who specialized in cases the authorities couldn't or wouldn't pursue. "Your wife's boyfriend has interesting friends," Marcus reported during a meeting at a diner outside of town. "Gene English has been associating with Wilson Burgess, a career criminal who specializes in recruiting desperate people for dirty work." Herbert's jaw tightened. The shooter, Lloyd Haney, 23 years old, struggling with mental health issues, buried in medical debt after his mother's cancer treatment. Someone paid his debts and promised him more money to shoot up the supermarket. "According to my sources, he was supposed to fire some shots and disappear, but he panicked when security showed up. So they recruited a sick kid to commit murder. And when he became a liability, they let him die rather than risk exposure." Marcus slid a folder across the table. "I've got bank records showing payments from one of Gene's shell companies to Haney's creditors. Your wife and her boyfriend are accessories to murder." Herbert studied the documents, his mind already working through the implications. "Can we take this to the police? The evidence is circumstantial. Good enough to raise questions, but not enough for convictions. These people covered their tracks well." Marcus leaned back in his booth. "But that's not why you hired me, is it?" Herbert met the investigator's eyes. Marcus had spent 30 years working cases where the guilty walked free on technicalities, where justice was a luxury the system couldn't afford. He understood that sometimes the law wasn't enough. "I need to know their plans," Herbert said. "When they're leaving, where they're going, how much money they've stolen. And then I'm going to make sure they never hurt anyone again." That evening, Herbert sat in his study reviewing Marcus's intelligence reports while Brooke watched television in the living room. According to intercepted communications, she and Gene were planning to disappear in 2 weeks. They'd already purchased fake identities and had booked flights to Mexico under assumed names. The money they'd stolen, nearly $500,000 from Herbert's business account plus another $100,000 from their joint savings, was already waiting in an offshore bank. They'd also stolen client information from Herbert's business, planning to sell construction plans and property details to competitors. But Herbert had an advantage they didn't know about. He was aware of their entire operation. He began making his own preparations. First, he called his business partner, Dennis Downey, and arranged to take 2 weeks of vacation time. Then he visited his lawyer, ostensibly to update his will, but actually to ensure Cassie would be protected if something happened to him. Most importantly, he began assembling the tools he'd need for what came next. From his construction sites, he acquired materials that couldn't be traced back to him: rope, cable ties, industrial-grade chemicals, and power tools. From his contacts in the demolition business, he obtained items that were harder to find but equally necessary. Herbert had learned patience during his years in construction. Good work took time, careful planning, and attention to detail. The same principles applied to revenge. As he finalized his plans, Herbert thought about the families of the shooting victims. He thought about Lloyd Haney, a sick young man manipulated into murder by people who saw him as disposable. He thought about Cassie, who deserved better than a mother who could orchestrate killings to cover her theft. Brooke and Gene had started this war when they decided innocent lives were acceptable casualties. Now Herbert was going to finish it. The game was about to begin, and only one side knew the rules. Chapter 4. Setting the Trap. Herbert's plan required precise timing and careful choreography. While Brooke believed she was manipulating him, he was actually orchestrating every move like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. The first phase began on a Monday morning. Herbert arrived at work early and called an emergency meeting with his foreman, Lewis Mann, and his core crew. These were men who'd worked with him for years, who understood that loyalty was a two-way street. "I need some work done off the books," Herbert told them, spreading blueprints across his desk. "Personal project, cash pay, and what happens at the site stays at the site." The project was a renovation of an abandoned warehouse Herbert had quietly purchased through a shell company 3 months earlier. Located in an industrial district that was largely deserted after dark, the building would serve as the perfect venue for what he had planned. While his crew worked on preparing the warehouse, Herbert began the delicate process of feeding information to his targets. Using Marcus Webb as an intermediary, he ensured that Gene English learned about a high-stakes poker game scheduled for the following Thursday, one with a buy-in large enough to attract serious players and serious money. The game was real, but Herbert had convinced the organizer, Santos Clifford, to let him host it at a different location. Santos owed Herbert a favor from a construction job that had saved his bar from bankruptcy, and he didn't ask questions when Herbert offered to provide a more secure venue. "Better lighting, no police patrols, and I'll cover the dealer fees," Herbert had explained. Santos agreed without hesitation. Meanwhile, Herbert planted evidence that would draw Brooke to the same location. He left carefully staged documents in his home office, blueprints for a non-existent project, financial records showing phantom assets, and correspondence about a valuable construction contract that could be stolen and sold. The beauty of the plan was that both targets would come to the warehouse voluntarily, each believing they were there to further their own schemes. Herbert also made other preparations. He arranged for Cassie to spend the weekend with her grandmother, telling Brooke he wanted to surprise her with a romantic getaway. He cleaned out his legitimate bank accounts, transferring the funds to accounts Brooke couldn't access. Most importantly, he spent hours at the warehouse, fine-tuning every detail of what would unfold there. The space had been transformed into something that looked like a high-end private club. Expensive furniture, professional lighting, a full bar. But beneath the surface, Herbert had installed less obvious features. Soundproofing, reinforced doors with electronic locks, and surveillance equipment that would record everything. By Wednesday evening, all the pieces were in position. Gene had confirmed his attendance at the poker game, bringing the money he'd stolen from Herbert as his stake. Brooke had discovered the planted documents and was planning her own infiltration of the warehouse to steal what she believed were valuable business secrets. Neither knew the other would be there. Neither knew they were walking into a trap. As Herbert lay in bed that night, listening to Brooke's steady breathing beside him, he felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Tomorrow night would bring justice for Lloyd Haney, for the shooting victims, and for every life these two had destroyed in their pursuit of money. But first, he had one more piece of business to attend to. Thursday morning, Herbert made a call to Wilson Burgess, the criminal who had recruited Lloyd Haney for the supermarket shooting. Using information provided by Marcus Webb, Herbert arranged a meeting under the pretense of hiring Burgess for a job. They met at a truck stop outside of town, where Herbert presented himself as a businessman with a problem that required unconventional solutions. "I need someone to disappear," Herbert told Burgess, sliding an envelope of cash across the table. "Permanently. Someone who's been asking too many questions about a mutual friend named Lloyd Haney." Burgess counted the money with greedy eyes. This mutual friend got a name: Marcus Webb, private investigator. He's been digging into Lloyd's business, and he's getting close to things that should stay buried. The lie came easily to Herbert's lips. Burgess didn't know that Marcus was working for Herbert, didn't know that the mutual friend relationship was fiction. All he saw was easy money for eliminating a potential threat. When and where? Burgess asked. Herbert provided an address, the warehouse where tomorrow night's poker game would take place. He told Burgess that Marcus would be there conducting surveillance, alone and vulnerable. "There's just one condition," Herbert added. "It has to look like an accident. Nothing that traces back to anyone involved." Burgess nodded, already planning his approach. He had no idea that he was actually being set up to attend the same location where Jean and Brooke would be carrying out their own schemes. As Herbert drove home that afternoon, he mentally reviewed his preparations one final time. 3 targets, each believing they were pursuing their own agenda, each unaware they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Tomorrow night, the warehouse would host more than just a poker game. It would be the venue for a reckoning that had been months in the making. Herbert Durham had always been a builder, a creator of structures that would stand the test of time. But tomorrow night, he would prove equally skilled at destruction. Chapter 5: Convergence. Thursday evening arrived with a light rain that seemed fitting for what Herbert had planned. As darkness fell over the industrial district, 3 separate groups made their way toward the abandoned warehouse, each believing they were alone in their mission. Jean English arrived first, dressed in an expensive suit he couldn't afford and carrying a briefcase containing nearly $200,000 in stolen money. He parked his rented BMW behind the building and entered through the main entrance, where Santos' Clifford security team directed him to the poker room. The game was already in progress when Jean took his seat. Herbert watched from the security office, observing through hidden cameras as his wife's lover tried to project confidence while nursing a whiskey and studying his cards. Jean was a mediocre player whose arrogance exceeded his skill, exactly the kind of mark that serious gamblers loved to exploit. 20 minutes later, Brooke arrived. She parked 2 blocks away and approached the warehouse from the south, dressed in black and carrying a bag of tools for breaking and entering. She'd done her homework, having spent days studying the building's layout and identifying what she believed was the most vulnerable entry point. What she didn't know was that Herbert had been feeding her that information, carefully guiding her to the exact route he wanted her to take. Brooke slipped through a loading dock that Herbert had left conveniently unlocked. Her goal was the office complex on the 2nd floor, where she believed Herbert was storing valuable business documents. She moved through the darkened corridors with confidence, unaware that every step was being recorded. The third arrival came at exactly 9 o'clock. Wilson Burgess entered through a side entrance, carrying a pistol and expecting to find Marcus Webb conducting surveillance. Instead, he found himself in a maze of corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, growing increasingly frustrated as he searched for his target. Herbert watched all 3 from his command center, a converted office space that gave him complete oversight of the warehouse. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The convergence began when Brooke's presence triggered a motion sensor Herbert had installed in the office complex. The alert appeared on his monitor just as Jean was losing heavily at the poker table, his stolen money rapidly disappearing to more skilled players. Herbert activated the next phase of his plan with the press of a button. Electronic locks engaged throughout the building, sealing all exits. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. And throughout the warehouse, hidden speakers began broadcasting a message Herbert had prepared. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are now participants in an evening of accountability." The poker game stopped as players looked around in confusion. Jean's face went white as he recognized Herbert's voice. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Herbert Durham. My wife and her lover are both in this building tonight, along with the man who helped them murder 3 innocent people." In the office complex, Brooke froze as she heard her husband's voice echoing through the corridors. Her mind raced, trying to understand how Herbert could have known about her plans. Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, had found his way to the main warehouse floor and was trying to force open a door that refused to budge. The reality of his situation was beginning to dawn on him. "Jean English," Herbert's voice continued, "you're currently losing money that you stole from me at a poker game in the East Wing. The briefcase beside your chair contains evidence of your theft, your affair, and your role in orchestrating a mass shooting." Jean started to stand, but Santos' Clifford security team had already moved to surround him. These were men who understood that crossing Herbert Durham was bad for business. "Brooke Durham, my beloved wife, You're attempting to steal documents from the second-floor office. Unfortunately for you, those documents are forgeries, and your every move has been recorded. Brooke's hands shook as she tried her phone, finding no signal. Herbert had installed jammers throughout the building, and Wilson Burgess, the man who recruited a sick young man to commit murder, you're currently trying to escape through the south corridor. The gun in your jacket won't help you. The doors are reinforced steel, and the windows are bulletproof. The warehouse fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sound of rain on the roof. Herbert let the silence stretch, allowing fear to take hold before continuing. You all came here tonight thinking you were in control, thinking you were pursuing your own agendas. But you've actually volunteered to participate in something much more important: justice. Herbert's voice changed, becoming colder and more dangerous. 3 innocent people died because of your greed. A young man named Lloyd Haney was manipulated into committing murder and then abandoned to die. My daughter nearly became a victim of your schemes. And you did all of this for money. Through his cameras, Herbert could see the fear in their faces. Jean was surrounded by men who would follow Herbert's orders without question. Brooke was trapped in a corridor with no way out. Wilson Burgess was pacing like a caged animal, his desperation growing with each passing moment. So now we're going to play a different kind of game, Herbert announced. One where the stakes are considerably higher than money. The warehouse plunged into darkness as Herbert cut the emergency lighting. When the lights returned a moment later, everything had changed. Jean found himself handcuffed to his chair, the poker game abandoned as Santos and his men revealed their true purpose. Brooke discovered that the corridor she'd been trapped in had filled with a thin mist. Not dangerous, but disorienting and frightening. Wilson Burgess was no longer alone. Herbert's construction crew had emerged from concealment, surrounding him with the quiet competence of men who'd built their lives with their hands. Let the games begin. Herbert's voice echoed through the warehouse, carrying a promise of retribution that made his target's blood run cold. Chapter 6. The Reckoning begins. In the East Wing poker room, Gene English found himself facing a tribunal he'd never expected. Santos Clifford had cleared the other players from the room, leaving only Herbert's hand-picked jury, men who'd known Herbert for years and understood the depth of his betrayal. "You killed my friend's wife," said Lewis Mann, Herbert's foreman, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in construction. "Sarah Mitchell. She was buying groceries for her grandkids when your shooter started firing." Gene's face had gone ashen. "I didn't know anyone would actually die. It was supposed to be a distraction, just some shots fired to cause panic." "But people did die," Santos added, his scarred hands folded on the table. 3 people, plus the kid you used as your weapon. That makes you responsible for 4 deaths. Meanwhile, in the second-floor office complex, Brooke found herself in a different kind of maze. The mist Herbert had released wasn't harmful, but it carried a psychological weight that pressed down on her with each breath. As she moved through the corridors, she began to encounter displays Herbert had prepared. Photographs of the shooting victims, copies of her own text messages discussing the plan, and financial records showing every dollar she'd stolen. "You were planning to take Cassie with you to Mexico." Herbert's voice spoke through hidden speakers, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "My daughter was going to become an accessory to murder because her mother valued money more than human life." Brooke's composure finally cracked. "Herbert, please. We can work this out. I'll give back the money. We can go to counseling." "Too late for that, Brooke. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed when you decided innocent people were acceptable casualties." On the main warehouse floor, Wilson Burgess faced a different kind of justice. Herbert's construction crew had formed a circle around him, their work-hardened faces impassive as they listened to Herbert's voice detailing Burgess's crimes. "This man specializes in recruiting desperate people to commit crimes for him," Herbert announced. Lloyd Haney wasn't his first victim, and he wouldn't have been his last. Wilson Burgess turns human misery into profit. Burgess pulled his gun, but found himself facing 6 men who'd spent their careers working with dangerous equipment and weren't intimidated by a single pistol. "I wouldn't do that," said Dennis Downey, Herbert's business partner, stepping forward. "We're all licensed to carry, and we all have families." You threatening us just makes this easier." As the three separate confrontations unfolded, Herbert began to reveal the true scope of his preparation. Every conversation, every movement, every desperate plea was being recorded by high-definition cameras. But this wasn't just about creating evidence. It was about ensuring that the truth would survive whatever happened next. "You're all wondering what comes next," Herbert's voice continued. "Whether I'm going to kill you, turn you over to the police, or just let you go with a warning. The answer is none of the above." In the poker room, Gene's handcuffs were removed, but his freedom was illusory. The room's exits remained locked, and Santos's men made it clear they would prevent any escape attempts. "You're going to call your contact at the bank in the Cayman Islands," Herbert instructed. "You're going to transfer every dollar of stolen money back to my accounts. And then you're going to sign a confession detailing your role in the supermarket shooting. And if I refuse?" Herbert's laugh was cold and humorless. "Then you'll discover what happens to people who murder children for money." Lewis Mann's grandson was at that supermarket, Gene. He's 6 years old, and he still wakes up screaming from nightmares about the shooting. Lewis has very strong opinions about people who traumatize children. In the office complex, Brooke found herself facing a different choice. Herbert had provided her with a phone and a simple ultimatum: call the police and confess to her role in the shooting, or face the consequences of her actions in a more direct manner. "You always said I wasn't smart enough to see through your schemes," Herbert told her. "But I've been recording every conversation you've had with Gene for months. I have evidence of your financial theft, your planning of the shooting, and your complete lack of remorse for the people who died." Brooke's hands shook as she held the phone. "Herbert, I'm your wife. I'm Cassie's mother. You stopped being my wife when you decided to murder innocent people. And Cassie deserves better than a mother who sees other people as disposable." Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, was facing the most direct form of justice. Herbert's crew had produced lengths of rope and were methodically tying him to a chair, their movements efficient and professional. "You recruited a sick kid to commit murder," Dennis Downey told him. "Then you let him die to cover your tracks. In our business, we call that criminal negligence leading to death." Burgess struggled against his bonds. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping. Assault." "What we're doing," Herbert's voice responded, "is giving you the same choice you gave Lloyd Haney. Cooperate and live, or refuse and face the consequences." As the night wore on, the pressure on all three targets intensified. Gene found his accounts systematically emptied as Herbert's team used his own banking information against him. Brooke discovered that every escape route had been sealed, every plea for mercy met with recordings of her own callous discussions about the shooting victims. Wilson Burgess learned that his criminal network had been thoroughly infiltrated by Marcus Webb's investigation. But Herbert wasn't finished. The true test was yet to come, and it would determine not just their punishment, but whether any of them had retained enough humanity to feel genuine remorse for what they'd done. The warehouse fell silent as Herbert prepared for the final phase of his plan, one that would force his targets to confront the full weight of their crimes and decide whether they deserved the mercy they denied to others. Chapter 7: Breaking Points. The silence in the warehouse stretched until it became a living thing, pressing against the walls and settling into the bones of everyone present. Herbert had withdrawn his voice, allowing his three targets to stew in their fear and contemplate the magnitude of their situation. In the poker room, Gene English sat surrounded by evidence of his crimes, watching as his stolen fortune disappeared transaction by transaction. Santos Clifford operated the laptop with methodical precision, transferring funds back to Herbert's accounts while Gene's hands remained zip-tied behind his back. $237,000, Santos announced. "That's what you stole from a man who trusted you enough to let you into his home." Gene's composure had cracked completely. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched his dreams of escape evaporate. "You don't understand." Brooke said Herbert was planning to fire half his crew. "We were trying to protect people's jobs." Lewis Mann's laugh was harsh and humorless. "My job? The job I've had for 15 years? The job that feeds my family and put my kids through college." He leaned close to Gene's face. "You killed my friend's wife to steal money for your escape fund. Don't insult us with lies about protecting anyone. Meanwhile, Brooke had been moved to a different room, one that Herbert had prepared specifically for her. The walls were covered with photographs, crime scene images from the supermarket shooting, family photos of the victims, and pictures of Lloyd Haney before his descent into desperation. "Look at them," Herbert's voice commanded through the speakers. Sarah Mitchell, 62 years old, grandmother of 4. David Chun, 37, father of twin daughters. Rebecca Torres, 29, pregnant with her first child. Brooke closed her eyes, but Herbert's voice continued relentlessly. And Lloyd Haney, 23 years old, diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, buried under medical debt from his mother's cancer treatment. The perfect target for your boyfriend's recruitment scheme. When Brooke opened her eyes, she found herself facing a video screen that began playing security footage from a supermarket. She watched as shoppers fled in terror, as people fell bleeding to the floor, as children screamed for their parents. "You orchestrated this," Herbert said. "Every scream, every drop of blood, every family destroyed. It all traces back to your decision that money was worth more than human life." On the main warehouse floor, Wilson Burgess faced a different kind of confrontation. Herbert's crew had assembled what looked like a construction site tribunal, complete with materials and tools that served as both props and implicit threats. 23 years old, Dennis Downey said, reading from Lloyd Haney's file. Worked 2 jobs to pay for his mother's chemotherapy. No criminal record, no history of violence. The perfect victim for a predator like you. Burgess had stopped struggling against his bonds, but his eyes still held defiance. The kid volunteered. Nobody forced him to do anything. "You paid his debts and promised him enough money to start over," Herbert's voice responded. "Then you gave him a gun and instructions to shoot up a crowded supermarket. Well, he panicked and the plan went wrong. You abandoned him to die." Herbert emerged from the shadows, appearing in person for the first time since the night began. He moved between the 3 locations, observing his captives with the same careful attention he brought to construction projects. In the poker room, he studied Jean's collapse with clinical interest. "You're not the first man to throw away his life for a married woman, but you might be the first to commit murder for one." "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Jean pleaded. "The shooting was Brooke's idea. She said you had insurance policies that would pay out if you died. She wanted to make it look like you were killed in a random crime." Herbert's expression didn't change, but Santos and the other men shifted uncomfortably. The revelation that Brooke had been planning Herbert's murder added another layer to an already complex web of betrayal. Moving to Brooke's room, Herbert found his wife curled in a corner, finally confronting the reality of what she'd done. The video screen continued its loop of security footage, forcing her to watch the consequences of her actions over and over. "Please make it stop," she whispered. "The way you made it stop for Sarah Mitchell's grandchildren, the way you made it stop for David Chen's daughters." Herbert's voice was steady, but underneath lay a fury that had been building for months. "They don't get to see their families again because you decided their lives were less important than your bank account." Finally, Herbert stood before Wilson Burgess, studying the man who'd turned human desperation into profit. Burgess had recruited dozens of people over the years, the desperate, the addicted, the mentally ill, and used them as disposable weapons in crimes that enriched him while destroying them. "You're a predator," Herbert said simply. "You hunt people when they're at their weakest, when they have no other options, and you turn them into weapons. Lloyd Haney wasn't your first victim, and he wouldn't have been your last." Burgess finally showed a crack in his defiance. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than whatever they're paying you. I want justice for a 23-year-old kid who died because you convinced him that murder was his only way out of debt." Herbert's voice carried a finality that made everyone in the warehouse tense. "I want accountability for 3 innocent people who died because of your schemes. And I want to make sure you never destroy another family." As dawn approached, Herbert prepared for the final phase of his plan. He'd gathered evidence, extracted confessions, and recovered the stolen money. But justice required more than just restitution. It demanded consequences that would ensure these crimes could never be repeated. The three targets had been broken down, their defenses stripped away, their crimes laid bare. Now came the moment when Herbert would decide their fate and whether mercy had any place in true justice. Chapter 8. The Verdict. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the warehouse windows, Herbert Durham stood at the center of his carefully constructed court of justice. Around him, the evidence of months of planning lay spread across tables and screens. Financial records, communications, photographs, and video testimonies that painted a complete picture of conspiracy, theft, and murder. Gene English sat slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. The laptop screen showed his accounts had been emptied, every stolen dollar returned to Herbert's control. But more than money had been taken, his dignity, his hope of escape, and his illusions about the woman he'd betrayed everything for. "She was going to kill you," Gene said suddenly, his voice hoarse from hours of interrogation. "Brooke didn't just want the money. She wanted you dead so she could claim the insurance and take Cassie somewhere you'd never find them." Herbert nodded, unsurprised. "I know. I've known for weeks." In the adjacent room, Brooke had stopped watching the security footage. She sat with her knees drawn up, her expensive clothes rumpled and stained with tears. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered when Herbert entered. "But they did die, and you celebrated their deaths because they covered your theft." Herbert's voice carried no warmth, no echo of the man who'd once loved her. "You sent me a text that night, remember? While families were identifying bodies at the morgue, you were texting about how perfectly everything had worked out." Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, had begun to crack under the weight of his own crimes. Dennis Downey and the construction crew had spent hours detailing every victim Burgess had recruited over the years, every life he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. 43 people, Dennis announced, reading from Marcus Webb's investigation files. 43 desperate souls you've used as weapons over the past 8 years. Addicts, mentally ill, people drowning in debt. You turn their suffering into your income. Herbert moved between the three rooms like a judge reviewing evidence before sentencing. In each space, he found people who'd convinced themselves their crimes were justified, their victims somehow deserving of destruction. The moment of truth came when Herbert gathered all three in the main warehouse space. They were brought together for the first time since the night began, each seeing the other's degradation and realizing the scope of Herbert's knowledge. "You're going to call the police," Herbert announced. "All three of you. You're going to confess to your roles in the supermarket shopping, the theft, and the conspiracy to commit murder." Gene looked up with desperate hope. "And then what? We go to prison, but we live?" "That depends on whether you choose to do the right thing for the first time in your miserable lives." Herbert activated a large screen that dominated one wall of the warehouse. It showed a conference call setup with 3 separate phone lines, each connected to different law enforcement agencies. FBI, state police, and local authorities were all standing by to receive confessions. "But before you make those calls," Herbert continued, "I want you to understand something about consequences." The screen changed to show surveillance footage from outside the warehouse. 3 graves had been dug in the industrial wasteland behind the building, each marked with a simple wooden cross. "Those graves took my crew 6 hours to dig. They're exactly 6 feet deep, properly measured and professionally excavated. If you choose not to cooperate, if you decide to maintain your innocence or try to implicate others, those graves will be put to use." The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gene's face went white, Brooke began sobbing, and Wilson Burgess tested his bonds with renewed desperation. "You're bluffing," Burgess said, but his voice shook. "You're not a killer." Herbert walked to a table covered with construction equipment and picked up a pneumatic nail gun. The tool was industrial grade, powerful enough to drive 4-inch nails through steel beams. "I'm not a killer," Herbert agreed. "But I'm a man whose family was targeted for murder, whose life's work was stolen, and whose community was terrorized by people who think other human beings are disposable. Sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect the innocent." He pointed the nail gun at a wooden beam and fired. The nail drove completely through the 6-inch timber with a sharp crack that echoed through the warehouse. "Here's how this works," Herbert continued. "You each get one phone call to confess. You provide complete details about your crimes, name your accomplices, and accept full responsibility for the deaths you caused. In exchange, you get to live to stand trial." "And if we refuse?" Brooke asked, her voice barely a whisper. Herbert's smile was cold and final. "Then you'll discover that some crimes are too serious for the courts to handle. Some punishments have to be immediate and permanent." The nail gun fired again, this time into the concrete floor. Chips of concrete flew in all directions, leaving a crater where the nail had struck. "Who wants to go first?" The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of final decisions. Three people who'd thought themselves clever, who believed they could manipulate and murder without consequences, now faced the reality that their victim had been more cunning than any of them imagined. Herbert Durham had built more than a successful construction company. He'd built a trap that had taken months to complete and was now ready to spring shut. The only question was whether his prey would choose confession and prison, or defiance and the graves that waited in the darkness outside. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The first call came from Gene English, his hands shaking as he dialed the FBI field office. Herbert had provided him with the direct number for Agent Richard Stevens, who'd been investigating financial crimes in the region and was very interested in hearing about stolen construction funds and murder conspiracies. "My name is Gene English," he began, his voice cracking. "I need to confess to conspiracy to commit murder, theft of federal funds, and accessory to the deaths of 4 people. Agent Stevens was professional, but clearly surprised by the unsolicited confession. As Gene detailed, the supermarket shooting plot, the theft of Herbert's business funds, and Wilson Burgess's recruitment of Lloyd Haney. Herbert monitored the call while watching his wife and Burgess process their rapidly diminishing options. Brooke went next, calling the state police detective who'd been investigating the supermarket shooting. Detective Wesley Schultz had been frustrated by the lack of leads in the case, and Brooke's confession provided the breakthrough he'd been seeking. "I planned the shooting to cover my theft of my husband's money," she said, each word seeming to physically pain her. "We recruited a mentally ill young man to commit the murders, then abandoned him to die when the plan went wrong." As she provided details about the offshore accounts, the fake documents, and the timeline of the conspiracy, Herbert felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Justice was being served, but not in the way his targets had expected. Wilson Burgess held out the longest, his criminal experience making him suspicious of easy deals. But when Herbert began cleaning the nail gun with deliberate slowness, Burgess's resolve finally cracked. His call went to the Organized Crime Task Force, where Detective Jeffrey Alvarez had been tracking Burgess's activities for years without enough evidence to make charges stick. The confession was like Christmas morning for law enforcement. "I've been recruiting vulnerable people to commit crimes for 8 years, Burgess admitted. Lloyd Haney was just the latest. I paid his debts and convinced him to shoot up the supermarket as a distraction for a theft operation." As the 3 confessions were recorded and transmitted to authorities, Herbert revealed the final phase of his plan. The warehouse hadn't just been a venue for extracting justice. It had been designed as a comprehensive evidence facility. "Every conversation you've had here tonight has been recorded," Herbert announced. "Every confession, every admission of guilt, every detail of your crimes. But more importantly, every piece of evidence I've gathered over the past 3 months has been simultaneously transmitted to law enforcement agencies." The screen displayed a complex web of information: financial records showing the stolen money's trail, communications between the conspirators, surveillance footage from before and after the shooting, and complete profiles of every victim they created. "Marcus Webb has been coordinating with federal investigators for weeks," Herbert continued. "Your arrests were inevitable. Tonight just determined whether you'd be taken alive or found in those graves outside." Gene's eyes widened with realization. "You never intended to kill us." "Wrong. I fully intended to kill you if you'd chosen to maintain your innocence. If you'd continued to treat your victims as disposable, I would have returned the favor." Herbert's voice carried absolute conviction. But you made the right choice. You chose to face justice instead of defying it. As dawn broke fully over the industrial district, the sound of sirens approached the warehouse. Herbert had sent GPS coordinates to all 3 law enforcement agencies, along with a complete briefing on what they'd find inside. The arrests were swift and professional. Gene English was taken into custody by federal agents for financial crimes and conspiracy charges. Brooke Durham was arrested by state police for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to 4 deaths. Wilson Burgess faced the most serious charges: organized crime, conspiracy, and multiple counts of accessory to murder spanning 8 years. But Herbert's plan had one final element that none of them had anticipated. As the last police car disappeared down the industrial road, Herbert activated a series of explosive charges placed throughout the warehouse. The building collapsed in a controlled demolition that left nothing but rubble and dust, destroying any evidence of what had actually transpired during those dark hours. The official story would be simple. An anonymous tip had led to the arrests of 3 co-conspirators in the supermarket shooting. Their confessions provided complete closure for the case, justice for the victims' families, and answers that law enforcement had been seeking for months. 3 weeks later, Herbert sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the final details of his divorce for Brooke. She would plead guilty to all charges and spend the rest of her life in prison. Gene English faced 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. Wilson Burgess would never see freedom again. "What about Cassie?" his lawyer asked. Herbert's expression softened slightly. His daughter was staying with her grandmother while he arranged for permanent custody. She'd been told that her mother had made terrible choices and would be away for a very long time. "She'll be protected," Herbert said simply. From all of this, the stolen money had been recovered and returned to Herbert's accounts. His construction business was stronger than ever, with new contracts coming in as word spread about his family's ordeal and the justice that had been served. But most importantly, Herbert had sent a message that would echo through the criminal community for years to come. Some people couldn't be manipulated, some families couldn't be threatened, and some crimes demanded consequences that the courts couldn't provide. As Herbert drove home to collect his daughter from her grandmother's house, he passed the empty lot where the warehouse had stood. Nothing remained but cleared ground, ready for new construction. He'd torn down the structure that had housed his revenge, but the foundation of justice he'd built would last forever. Lloyd Haney and the other victims had been avenged. The predators who destroyed innocent lives were caged. And Herbert Durham had proven that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to become more ruthless than the evil itself. His phone buzzed with a text from Cassie. "Daddy, when are you coming to get me? Grandma made cookies." Herbert smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in months. Justice had been served, the guilty had been punished, and now he could focus on what truly mattered, protecting the innocent and building a future worthy of his daughter's love. The game was over, and the right side had won. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.